Monghan asked me to act in his stead today because he's in Taiwan. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who's Robert Holder. Robert is visiting us from Johns Hopkins University, just up the road in Baltimore, where he is doing his postdoc. And before he was at Johns Hopkins University, he was at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he did both a master's degree and a PhD. And before that, he is from my home state of Minnesota, where he did his bachelor's degree at Gustavus Adolphus. And I understand he has a degree not only in earth sciences from there, but also I think he said something like Scandinavian studies.
Yeah.
So if you want to speak in Swedish with Robert, he is conversant, I believe, fluent in Swedish. So anyway, it's my pleasure to welcome him to the department. He is a geochronologist and a metamorphic petrologist geochemist. And he's going to be talking to us today about a subject that's near and dear to my heart, metamorphism, and also the evolution of plate tectonics. So, welcome, Robert.
Thank you. I guess it seems like my voice is carrying. Is this actually on though? It's just for the recording? Okay, perfect. All right, thank you for the introduction. So the two bigger picture questions that I want to think about today in this talk are, when did modern plate tectonics develop on Earth, and how have Earth's tectonic processes changed through time? So if we look at Earth as a whole, one of its most defining features is that it has plate tectonics, where there's upwelling of the mantle beneath mid-ocean ridges, and that generates new oceanic lithosphere. That lithosphere is translated across ocean basins, where it's returned back into the mantle at subduction zones. And associated with the translations of those oceanic plates, the continents are continuously rifting apart in places and colliding back together in other places. And if we look at Earth as a whole, and we compare it to the other rocky bodies of our solar system, plate tectonics, which we can think of as a mode of planetary convection, or the surface expression of a mode of planetary convection that facilitates the cooling of the planet, seems to be something that's unique to Earth. So there's clearly other tectonic activity on the other rocky bodies. We have the large Valles Marineris on Mars. The surface of Venus is conspicuous in its lack of craters that suggests some resurfacing within the last billion years. There's extensive volcanism on planets like Io. There's really interesting geomorphic features on bodies like Titan. And then there's a range of lesser tectonic activity on some of the other bodies. But as geologists, from our perspective as geologists, plate tectonics is more than just a mode of planetary convection. It gives us an explanation, a framework for the distribution of rocks at Earth's surface. We can think about the distribution of the ages of the oceanic lithosphere, moving away from mid-ocean ridges. And we can look at the ages of rocks, such as this classic figure from the textbook, The Dynamic Earth, on key fossils that suggested and motivated the idea that the continents have moved relative to each other. And of course, we can think about these correlations across continents in terms of other rock types as well. And it also informs us about why there are mountain belts where they are on Earth, and the distributions of volcanic arcs, earthquakes, and other natural hazards. Globally, you can see they're not randomly distributed, but they have some predictable pattern that's related to plate tectonics. People have also suggested that plate tectonics is intimately tied to the emergence of life, another phenomenon, at least in terms of complex life, that seems to be unique to Earth as a rocky body in our solar system, specifically through the serpentinization of the oceanic lithosphere and the associated hydrothermal fluid flow, which could potentially have provided a source of energy as well as simple organic molecules for Earth's first life. And this has been suggested to possibly be related to subduction zones through cold seeps and mud volcanoes and forearcs, where chemosynthetic communities are observed today, and the famous black smokers near mid-ocean ridges. So both ends of the plate tectonic process. And in addition to the emergence of life, plate tectonics plays key roles in the evolution of life through time. So we can think about the distribution of continental lithosphere through the supercontinent cycles and how that's related to biodiversity, where the fragmentation of supercontinents seems to be related to the most massive radiations in biological diversification, both after the breakup of Rodinia and again after the breakup of Pangaea, punctuated by some mass extinctions. But the movement of plates seems to be intimately tied to the diversification of life. And then I mentioned mass extinctions there. Those have been hypothesized to be tied to volcanic plume activity or mantle plume activity, and so which has been hypothesized to be related to the initiation of continental breakups. So we have different ties to the way life has evolved and plate tectonic processes. And then we might also care about climate, particularly for our effects on the modern Earth, and we can think about how climate has changed, particularly in recent Earth history, through the Cenozoic, and how that's potentially tied to different tectonic events. So we can look at how average global temperatures have declined through the Cenozoic, possibly related to the initiation of the India-Asia collision, or more generally, the collisions that closed the Tethys Ocean. We can think about how changes in the plate positions allowed the onset of the circumpolar current, and how that's related to the formation of the Antarctic ice sheet and the large glaciations in the recent Earth's history, and other oceanic circulation changes such as the closure of the Isthmus of Panama, and how things like that might be related to more modern glacial cycles. And then the last thing I'll mention is that we can also think about economic geology. We can look at ore deposits, and we see that they're not evenly distributed within the rock record through time, and we might think about how different types of ore deposits and their formation or their preservation through time is related to different relationships with the supercontinent cycle. So these are just some example ore deposits shown here. So whatever it is that our particular interest is for geology or in studying the Earth, a fundamental question that we might ask if we care about any of those topics is how did the Earth evolve from something that was presumably much more like the other rocky bodies in our solar system in the past to the planet that we actually see and observe today? And as Sarah mentioned, and as the title of my talk suggests, I want to think about how we can look at metamorphism to potentially inform us about this transition through time. So the key to understanding why metamorphism is useful for asking these kind of questions, why metamorphism is useful for studying tectonic processes in general, is for the first concept we need to understand is that the movement of plates and plate tectonics in general results in an uneven distribution of geothermal gradients around the planet. So places where material is rising from deeper in the Earth towards the surface have higher thermal gradients, such as at mid-ocean ridges or in volcanic arcs and rift valleys, the hinterlands of orogenic belts, and places where material is being taken from the relatively cold surface of the Earth and moved down deeper into the Earth have colder than average thermal gradients. So places like subduction zones and the forelands of mountain belts. And this distribution, this heterogeneous distribution of geothermal gradients across Earth through time is important because of another concept that we can point to, the concept of metamorphic facies. And this is that for a particular rock, that rock will have a different mineral assemblage for different depths in the Earth, but also different temperatures. And we can take that concept a step further, and we can think about how an individual metamorphic facies, so a set of minerals that we predict for a particular rock, like a metamorphosed basalt, might be associated commonly with other metamorphic facies in different places globally. So these metamorphic facies don't occur randomly, but they occur in some spatial associations, and we call those associations metamorphic facies series. And these give us a first-order idea about what the local thermal gradient was, or the range of thermal gradients that typified a particular tectonic environment at the time of that metamorphism. So what we can do as geologists is we can go to the field and we can look for these metamorphic facies or these metamorphic facies series, these associations of metamorphic rocks in different environments, and use them to begin to infer what a tectonic environment was in that particular location in Earth's past, and how that part of Earth's crust has changed through time to what we see it as today. So this talk is going to be divided largely into two parts. The first one, I want to talk in a bit more detail about how we actually study tectonic processes with metamorphic rocks. And then for the second part of the talk, I want to get back to those bigger picture questions of thinking globally about secular changes in Earth's plate tectonic history through time. So the first part here, studying plate tectonics with metamorphic rocks. The very first question is, how deep was a metamorphic rock when it formed, and how high temperature was it? because again, that's going to inform us something about the thermal gradients that characterize that tectonic environment. So there's a few different ways that we can do this, and the three most prominent ways that people use are to look at the mineral assemblages of those rocks. So this is that concept of metamorphic facies, or more sophisticated versions of that. We can look specifically at the elemental compositions of minerals, or we can look at the isotopic compositions of minerals. All of these are sensitive to the conditions that those minerals grew in. So for the first one, looking at mineral assemblage, we might take a rock such as this granulite facies rock from Madagascar, where it has some particular set of minerals, and we describe their existence together as a mineral assemblage. And then if we know the proportions of all of the elements in that particular rock, how much silica there is, how much alumina there is, iron, oxygen, and so forth, and we know the thermodynamic properties of each of the minerals that are in that rock, or the possible minerals that might have been in that rock, such as their densities, so that's related to their stability with pressure in the earth, and their heat capacities, which tells us how those minerals, how their stability is related to temperature. Then we can calculate, for example, a diagram like this, where as a function of depth, where this is actually from the pressure, and temperature within the earth, different groups of minerals that are stable together at different conditions. So each of these fields, this is a fairly complex looking diagram, each of these fields is a region of depth and temperature within the earth, where for this rock, a specific mineral assemblage was stable. A group of minerals were stable together, but not stable together anywhere else in this pressure temperature space. And if the sample we're looking at, if the minerals did indeed grow in equilibrium, we should identify a field within a diagram like this that contains all of the minerals that we're interested in. So in this particular case, we have a rock, and those minerals are calculated to have possibly grown together somewhere between 10 and 18 kilometers depth within the earth, and at temperatures of around 950 degrees. So we have some sense of how temperature changed with depth in this environment, and we can start thinking about what that means for its tectonic setting. The other way is to look at elemental compositions of minerals. So we might take a mineral like titanite. So here's a nice crystal here from Norway, shown next to a pen for scale. And based on experiments that people have done, we know how the zirconium concentration of this particular mineral changes in titanite as a function of both depth and temperature. So we can measure that concentration, and it gives us a line in depth and temperature space that crystal could have equilibrated at, could have grown at. And what's particularly nice about this is we can use zoning of minerals, changes in, say, the zirconium concentration within the titanite from these high concentrations in bright colors down to lower concentrations in the rim, to maybe infer how that crystal not only grew at a particular condition, but how the conditions of that crystal, how the temperature of that rock changed through time as this particular mineral grew. So we can think of these not only as static environments, but as dynamic tectonic environments. And then we can look at the isotopic composition of minerals. And the most commonly used isotope system for determining temperatures within rocks is the oxygen isotope system. So we can look, for example, at the relative oxygen isotope composition of any two minerals, say quartz and some other minerals, a range of minerals shown here. And we can look at how that changes as a function of temperature, such as if we measure the composition of, say, a rutile and a quartz, we can look at the difference in their oxygen isotope composition and calculate a plausible temperature that they would have been in equilibrium at. And then we might have to do some corrections for the fact that oxygen diffuses fairly quickly, but we should be able to get at some reliable temperature information. But then one of the key things is that geological uncertainty is real. Rocks are complex, and they've had complex tectonic histories. So when we make these interpretations, what we really want is reproducibility. We want to have reproducibility within samples. So we want to have multiple methods within individual samples that give us a consistent result. And we want to have reproducibility among samples. So if we take this sample and we walk over to the next outcrop and take the next sample, we should get some kind of consistency. So here's an example of where we've done mineral assemblage calculations. We've looked at the zirconium concentrations in titanite. We could do concentrations of other elements. And we looked at the oxygen isotope compositions of minerals in different rocks and in the same rocks from different locations in this particular place in southern Madagascar. And we have a nice set of agreement that these rocks formed about 15 kilometers depth at 950 degrees. So the depth and the temperature are important, but plate tectonics changes through time. Timescales are also important. The Earth is not static, and that's one of the things that we're interested in addressing here. And so we also need ways to constrain time, to know how those temperatures and depths evolved through time. And the way we do this is through radiometric dating. So we can take a mineral that incorporates, say, a lot of uranium, but none of the daughter product of that radiogenic isotope, lead. And through time, that uranium will decay to lead, such that when we measure it today, the relative proportions of those tell us something about the time since that mineral grew. One of the problems is when we're studying these metamorphic terrains, they evolve over millions of years, sometimes even hundreds of millions of years, and the minerals that are best for this uranium-lead geochronology are not particularly useful for constraining the metamorphic conditions. They're not very sensitive to temperature, they're not very sensitive to pressure. They're stable over most of Earth's crust. So we can use various relationships between these phases, between these minerals that we date and the other minerals in the rock to get more information. So for example, this is a monazite grain included in a cordierite, and this orange halo around it is where the lattice of the cordierite has been obliterated. It's now amorphous due to radiation damage from the high uranium and thorium concentrations in that grain. So it's exactly what we want for geochronology, a very radiogenic mineral. We know the stability of the host mineral cordierite very well. We can calculate that the way that I showed you. And so if we get the age of this inclusion, we can use that inclusion relationship to give as a maximum age for that cordierite, and therefore get some constraints on where this rock was at some particular time in Earth's history. And then we can use cross-cutting relationships to get constraints in the other direction. So this is a metamorphic rock, another metamorphic rock from Madagascar, where we can see the metamorphic foliation here, and that's cut by this late granite. So if we get an age on this granite, that gives us a minimum age for when this metamorphism was. This had to have come in after the metamorphism that formed this fabric here. So we get maxima and minima to begin to constrain when metamorphism actually happened. And then we can start to look more complexly at mineral composition again in this case. So these are monazite crystals, and each of these spots is 10 microns across. So we're looking at the zoning of yttrium within 3 different monazite crystals. And then we've gone in and analyzed them at the very fine scale for the age to see how the composition and the age of these crystals vary through time. And so we might look at a compositional parameter like the gadolinium to terbium ratio. We might see some systematic trend through time, and we might see how that's related to some other feature we care about, like a leucosome, a granite that formed as this rock got so hot that it melted. And then based on our understanding of how this rock evolved through time from looking at the minerals in this rock, we might have some models, say, as this rock was heated, how the garnet is predicted to have changed as the rock is decompressed, so it's brought back towards Earth's surface and then cooled off again. And we can compare the predictions from that type of model to how the actual compositions of the minerals changed. And the details of this aren't too important for this talk, but the point is that we can relate these minerals that we get ages from directly to the temperatures and pressures that this metamorphic rock experienced through time through these types of compositional parameters. And then once we have that information about how a particular rock moved in space through time from plate tectonics, and how the temperature of this particular part in Earth changed through time as a function of its tectonic setting, we can make a model to see what might be plausible. So we might take, say, crust and the mantle lithosphere beneath it, and we might contract it to thicken that, and see how the geothermal gradient of that setting evolved through time through a numerical model, something like this, where the initial thermal gradient looks something like this, and it increases through time because of the thickening of the crust. And we might compare our data on how our particular sample in this metamorphic terrain moved to find a plausible model, a plausible tectonic scenario that matches it. So that's a bit of how we study metamorphic rocks. That's the workflow that we go through to try and understand when we as geologists go in the field and see a metamorphic rock, what is that telling us about how that part of Earth evolved through time? And now I want to take a step back and think about how we can use compilations of that type of data around the globe and through time to think about how plate tectonics or tectonics in general might have evolved, how tectonics in Earth's past might not be the same as what we see today. And so I want to get back to these questions of when did modern plate tectonics develop, and how have Earth's tectonic processes changed through time. Now, an important place to start is what have other people suggested for the onset of plate tectonics? When did plate tectonics actually begin on Earth? So most data, and I say most with a question mark because not everyone would agree with this statement, but many would, and I think I would as well, suggest that it's somewhere between 3 and 2.5 billion years ago. That's when we start to see a lot of geochemical features, structural features of the Earth that are consistent with some aspects of plate tectonics as we know it. One of the basic observations is that before this time, terrains, regions of Earth's history that have crust older than 3 billion years, such as the Pilbara Craton, are characterized by a distinct structural style called dome and keel structures, where we see these massifs of granitic bodies separated by these screens of more mafic material and sedimentary material. And then when we go to terrains, to places on Earth where the rocks are younger than 2.5 billion years ago, that patchwork structural style changes to a regional linear structural style, such as seen here in this fold and thrust belt from the Canadian Cordillera. And you can see the scales on these are about the same. And the argument is that this type of horizontal translation of material is indicative of plate tectonics, whereas this type of blob-like structural style is indicative of some other tectonic mode. Another change that we see within this time in Earth's history is a systematic change in the composition of rocks. Specifically here we're looking at the average composition of shales, which are interpreted as some average of all of the material that's being eroded off of the continents. So some average sampling of the continental crust, maybe not perfect, but better than just sampling the outcrops we can see. And in this particular case, the study from Ming Tang, we can see that the weight percent of, say, magnesium in these particular samples decreased systematically through time. We might make some calculations about how that's related to something else like crustal mass. And the exact difference doesn't matter here, but the point is that there's a systematic change in the chemistry of the average crust across this period. And we might interpret that as, say, a change from a dominantly basaltic crust to a more felsic crust. But again, the exact change doesn't matter. The point is that there's a really large geochemical change towards something that's more like what we see today. We can look at the sedimentary record as well, and we can look at sequences of sedimentary rocks, sedimentary rock associations that might be interpreted as a passive margin. So the other end of the plate tectonics from the subduction zones. And we can see that these types of sedimentary sequences exist fairly continuously back through time until about 2.7 billion years ago. Again, this range here between 3 and 2.5 billion years being the possible inferred onset of plate tectonics, at least some mode of plate tectonics that's similar to what we actually see today. But what I want to talk about today is a bit of a paradox in this record, and that's that blue schists, which today are interpreted to be the metamorphic record, the direct metamorphic record of subduction on Earth, a type of metamorphic rock that's called blue schist because it's characterized by these blue amphiboles. This is a photomicrograph as seen through the microscope. They don't really exist in the early Earth. So if subduction is supposedly, and plate tectonics in general, began sometime back here, and metamorphic rocks are giving us a direct record of tectonic processes through time, where is the metamorphic record of subduction? Why don't we see it? And so that brings us to a few questions. One of them is, did plate tectonics, or plate tectonics as we define it today, actually occur in the early Earth as these other lines of evidence suggest? If subduction did occur on the early Earth, did it look different than modern subduction such that we just haven't recognized it systematically in the rock record? So maybe blue schists are what people have looked for, and blue schist is not what was produced in subduction in the past? Or did modern plate tectonics actually develop quite abruptly as suggested by the observations of blue schist in the geological record? Or was it a more gradual transition? Either way, why and how? So how can we reconcile these disparate lines of evidence for the tectonic evolution of our planet? So what I wanted to do was, rather than just looking at blue schist facies metamorphism, let's say that metamorphic rocks as a whole should be indicative of plate tectonics. It's not just that one particular mode. And so if we look at all of these data together, this is data that's compiled by Mike Brown, who you would all know in quite a bit of detail, I would imagine. is from over 500 terrains from throughout Earth's history. And we want to see what those tell us instead. So a good place to start is just looking at the modern, or just saying in the last 200 million years where we have a record of oceanic lithosphere, we feel we understand plate tectonics very well. What does the distribution of metamorphic data look like? And this is what they look like. We can see each of these dots is a particular data point of equilibrated temperature and pressure for a metamorphic rock. So behind each of these data points is a systematic set of work that I talked about in the first part of this talk. And we can see that they're not evenly distributed. There's a cluster of data that's distributed at relatively high pressure and slightly lower temperature. And then there's a cluster of data that's centered around at higher temperatures but much lower pressures. And if we just take the thermobaric ratios of each of these, so just divide the pressure by temperature to get some apparent thermal gradient, this is what the distribution looks like. And we see that nice bimodal distribution. So we're going to take this to be the metamorphic expression of plate tectonics. This is when we know plate tectonics is happening, and this is what the metamorphic record from that time looks like. And specifically, the low temperature divided by pressure, the low thermobaric ratio data points here are those that are associated with subduction zones and with underthrusting in the forelands of orogenic belts. And so what we're going to do is we're going to ask the question, how has this distribution, this record of plate tectonics, how has that changed going back through time? And what can we potentially hypothesize about what that means for changes in Earth's tectonic regime? So rather than looking at just the blue schist, which is what people have looked at in the past, we're going to look at the change in this bimodal distribution. But to do this type of analysis, we have to think a little bit about when these rocks actually formed. We can see that the distribution of metamorphic ages through time is not even. There are peaks in the data about 2.6 billion years ago, 1.9 billion years ago, 1.1, and half a billion years ago, and then in the modern. And these relationships seem to correlate with what other people have interpreted to be the supercontinent cycle. So this here we're showing age and just number of analyses for various zircons in various detrital records, so zircons extracted from sedimentary rocks globally and orogenic granitoids globally. And what we see is that there are consistent peaks defined in these data sets that match up very well with the ages of metamorphism through time. So we're going to interpret this to be the supercontinent cycle. And so rather than looking at the record continuously, to provide more statistically robust interpretations, we're going to look at supercontinent cycle to supercontinent cycle. How does the distribution change? What does the distribution look like? So this is the distribution I showed you already. It's this nice bimodal distribution. Here we're just looking at a histogram, so the data, as well as the kernel density estimate, which is a statistical estimate of what the continuous distribution of that data might look like, given the fewer data that are available. And we're going to take this bimodality as the signature of plate tectonics. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that distribution and we're going to fit it with two Gaussian distributions, the best two Gaussian distributions we can to describe that data set. And that's what this looks like up here. So we have a high temperature divided by pressure, a high thermobaric ratio mode, and a low thermobaric ratio mode. This is where the blue schists sit in the modern. If we go back to the previous supercontinent cycle, the assembly of Gondwana and Pangaea, we can see we still have a nice bimodal character to the distribution, but that distribution as a whole is less distinct. The best fit model peaks are closer together, they're a bit broader, and if we just look more qualitatively at the data as a whole, we see a more even distribution through time. If we go back further to the assembly and breakup of Rodinia, we can see that we've lost the prominence of data on the low TP end, but the data are still fit quite well by a bimodal distribution. But that bimodal distribution has shifted up in terms of thermobaric ratio. If we go back even further to the assembly and breakup of Columbia, or sometimes referred to as Nuna, we can see that now we've lost that shoulder, this low temperature over pressure shoulder, and the data are much more unimodal. They're still skewed to one side, they're not Gaussian, but we're losing the prominence of this low TP mode. And then if we go back into the Archean or data older than 2.2 billion years ago, statistically they can't be distinguished from a Gaussian distribution. They're Gaussian at the 95% confidence interval. And then one additional thing we might do is we might take these models and we might simply take the difference between the best fit peaks of these bimodal distributions. Something that looks like this. And we can see a nice continuous trend from a single distribution in the past through to an increasingly distinct bimodal distribution in the present. And again, these are the blue schists. They don't occur back here, but we do see this bimodal character go back through time. There we go. So there's the blue schist there. And so from that, we might suggest an alternative hypothesis. We might say that the modern expression of subduction metamorphism, that is blue schist facies metamorphism, is something that developed gradually since the onset of plate tectonics sometime in the Neoarchaean. So plate tectonics began, and it evolved continuously through time to what we see today. So plate tectonics may have operated, but maybe it didn't look the same. Maybe its expression in the rock record has changed. This is just another way to look at the data. So here we have the thermobaric ratio of all of the data points in this compilation, and we can see that from the Archean through to the Proterozoic, there's a steady increase in the diversity of metamorphic environments. And then from particularly the Paleoproterozoic into the modern, that diversity continues to increase, but there's also a systematic decrease in the average. So some type of cooling. So a very basic question we might ask is, this is the observation. Is there a mechanism that can explain why this change might have happened through time? Now, maybe the most obvious candidate to consider is secular cooling of the mantle. The Earth was hotter when it formed, and it's followed some thermal evolution since. Exactly what that thermal evolution is debated, but it's not so much debated that there has been some form of cooling. So shown here now are that distribution of data and the thermal evolution model from Claude Hertzberg and others in 2010, suggesting that Earth's mantle, upper mantle cooled from 1500 to 1600 degrees through to about 1300 degrees today. The reason the secular and cooling is important, and the reason that might change the expression of tectonics in the metamorphic record, is that if the mantle were hotter, as it decompressed at mid-ocean ridges, we predict a higher degree of partial melting, and therefore a thicker oceanic lithosphere to form from that melting. So both a thicker oceanic crust and a depleted mantle lithosphere beneath that crust. That in turn is potentially important because those changes in the thickness change the chemical buoyancy of the crust. And so we might expect that we might calculate as a function of mantle potential temperature the degree of melting, and associated with that degree of melting the thickness of the oceanic lithosphere. And we might model the cooling of that lithosphere through time to see when does that lithosphere become negatively buoyant? When is its density sufficient such that it could be subducted back into the mantle? And we see on the modern Earth, oceanic lithosphere is ready to subduct. It becomes denser than the mantle beneath it after only 10 to 30 million years, a very short time interval. Whereas for the much thicker oceanic lithosphere that might have existed earlier in the Earth, if this interpretation is correct, it could have taken on the order of hundreds of millions of years. The exact number is not so much important. The point is that it's much longer than today. And so if the oceanic lithosphere were thicker, that is potentially harder to bend and more buoyant, that might lead to shallower, hotter subduction. So maybe we have a difference in the style of subduction going back in the Earth's past, and maybe that can help us explain why we still see bimodality in the metamorphic record, but we see a distinct difference in the exact positions of those bimodal distributions. So just to talk a bit about this a little more, on the modern Earth, we can look at the distribution of oceanic lithosphere around the globe. That's what this orange histogram is showing you. And then based on some theoretical calculations, we might see how long would it take from when that oceanic lithosphere formed at a mid-ocean ridge to when it became negatively buoyant. Almost all of the oceanic lithosphere on Earth is predicted to be ready to subduct. In other words, once the mechanical barrier is overcome to subduction, it should be subductible. Whereas for the hotter Earth, if we assume something on the order of a similar age distribution of the oceanic lithosphere around the globe, the proportion of subductible lithosphere would have been significantly less. something on the order of 12%. Again, the exact numbers aren't important. The point is that we predict a difference in the oceanic lithosphere through time that might be changing the metamorphic record that we observe. We might also think about how that lithosphere cools through time. So these are half-space cooling models from Parsons and Scalater, and we can see as a function of depth and time how the thermal gradient of the crust changes. You see that the geothermal gradient lowers through time, so there's a lower thermal gradient here than there is at the mid-ocean ridge. On the modern Earth, very shortly after the oceanic lithosphere forms, it's negatively buoyant, it's ready to subduct. So there's a range of oceanic lithosphere thermal structures that are subducting today. Whereas on the ancient Earth, when it takes longer to reach negative buoyancy, maybe the range of thermal structures and the associated buoyancy of the oceanic lithosphere was more homogeneous. So those are some observations and some interpretations and hypothesizing based off of those. So I want to get back to these questions now of how did modern plate tectonics develop, and how, however, its tectonic processes possibly change through time. Now I've shown you some observations of the metamorphic data, some somewhat observations and somewhat calculations of mantle potential temperature, and then how those might relate to changes in the buoyancy of the oceanic lithosphere through time. So from these types of observations, we might propose a formal hypothesis that modern plate tectonics began when the time to neutral buoyancy for the oceanic lithosphere became substantially less than the average age of the oceanic lithosphere, allowing for a greater variety of subduction thermal conditions, including the steep cold subduction resulting in the formation of blue schist since the Neoproterozoic. That is the modern tectonics that we see. And so with this, we can put up these two hypotheses side by side. A hypothesis of continuous and gradual change since the Archean that I've suggested here, where there are gradual changes in the distributions of metamorphic rocks through time that are coupled to changes in the mantle potential temperature and maybe related through that to changes in the thickness and buoyancy of oceanic lithosphere. And that's contrasted to this idea that tectonics changed really abruptly in the Neoproterozoic, as evidenced by the sudden appearance of blue schist, as well as other things that I haven't discussed in this talk. The sudden appearance of ultra-high pressure metamorphism in collisional orogenic belts, a large increase in the abundance of kimberlites, the massive diversification of life within the Ediacaran. And what's particularly important is that each of these models gives us a different prediction. These models are only really valuable if they can be tested in some way. The model of gradual change predicts that Paleoproterozoic subduction should be observable in the rock record, but with higher thermal gradients, so higher temperatures relative to the pressures that they're at, and a gradual change from that type of metamorphic belt through to the modern could be observed. Whereas this lack of change until the Neoproterozoic would predict that there was no subduction or only isolated occurrences that aren't representative of the global tectonic regime at that time. So we can test this in two ways. We can test it with numerical models. We can take some model of subduction and that seems plausible, and we can change the mantle potential temperature. We can change the thickness of the lithosphere, maybe the continental and the oceanic lithosphere, and we can see how those models evolve through time to see whether they produce the types of metamorphic expressions that we see, the bimodal distributions of metamorphic rocks that we see. And so these are just some example models from Geology et al. In 2017, where they argue that they see, as they change mantle potential temperature in these models, a systematic and continuous change in the style of collisional orogenesis. So maybe something like that is important, but we have to remember that these are, of course, models, and that those models are created with the intent of investigating some particular process. So there's potentially some circularity in the way that they're created to observe something. And so we also want to compare those models with continued observation of the geological record. If these are the metamorphic PT conditions that we expect for the modern Earth, blue schist and eclogite facies metamorphism, and these are the conditions that we predict by this bimodal distributions to have been more prominent in the past, can we actually find subduction complexes that are characterized by only this type of metamorphism? We might look actually to modern analogs to answer this question. One place would be in California, where steep cold subduction, forming the blue schist of the classic Franciscan complex, at some point changed to very shallow subduction, which is interpreted to be due to the incoming of an oceanic plateau that is thicker, more buoyant lithosphere, like we expect to have been more common in Earth's past. And that resulted in a very big change in the style of metamorphic rocks produced by subduction, specifically a transition from this blue schist eclogite regime to a green schist garnet amphibolite regime in the Orocopiapolona-Rand schists. So maybe this is the type of model, maybe these are the types of rocks we could look for in the older rock record. And so we might look globally at Paleoproterozoic orogenic belts to see whether or not such complexes occur. And we might look more broadly at the modern Earth at subduction zones that range in slab dip to see what the metamorphic expression of those are and how that might have changed. And then finally, I wanted to point out that the data compilation that I've used here is based primarily on high-grade rocks, rocks that have pressure temperature conditions of these conditions out here. And that's because the ways that we constrain the conditions that these rocks reach is largely based on thermodynamic equilibria. And equilibrium is inhibited at low temperature due to kinetics. However, there's a range of relatively new thermobarometric techniques that we might be able to use to start investigating the metamorphic history of these low-grade metamorphic conditions with more precision and more detail to increase these types of data sets and look more systematically at changes in the rock record. One of the reasons that these contrasting hypotheses exist is because people are inferring changes based on the presence or absence of a particular type of rock. But if we want to look at change through time, I would argue that we need to look at rock types that exist throughout that entire time that we're interested in studying. And one way we might do this is looking at things like Raman shift barometry, so inclusion, elastic barometry. We can look at graphite ordering thermometry, how the ordering of graphite changes as a function of temperature. Clumped isotope thermometry of dolomites can be retained up to temperatures of nearly 400 degrees. And then we're increasingly getting better at doing geochronology of low temperature environments, for example, with uranium-lead dating of carbonates, but also with the traditional chronometers as well. And with that, thank you.
So do you account for the inherent sampling bias as you go back in time with these environments? Because you may not just have enough of the rock to actually make these kinds of measurements. It's just not preserved.
Yeah, that I think is the biggest challenge in studying the older Earth in general. So another hypothesis that I didn't discuss is that you can see they're very rare, but there are a few of these very low TP points. So these are low temperature eclogites that formed in collisional origins. And people, each time one of these points is published, there's basically a corresponding paper that says that this is identical to what we see in modern collisional orogenic belts, these low thermal gradient metamorphic rocks. And maybe that means exactly what you've said, that, or not exactly what you said, but the logical follow-up of that is that plate tectonics actually hasn't changed, but there's some systematic preservation bias that means that we just don't see these, that this is the same and this would be the same if we had a complete record. I think one advantage to thinking about this in terms of the full distributions, oops, that's not it. One advantage to thinking about this in terms of the full distributions of metamorphic rocks is, and maybe I'm wrong here, but that we could potentially see through some of that preservation bias. So what that model would predict is that if there's systematic preservation bias going back through time, the positions of the peaks shouldn't change, but this peak should become less prominent. And what we see is that that peak does become less prominent, but it also merges with the other peaks. So maybe there is systematic preservation bias against those, but I would argue that we still see a bimodality, and that potentially that means that the preservation bias isn't an issue. But really that's an important point that I think requires that we combine these numerical experiments with careful field observations.
What would be the potential cause for systematic preservation?
Sorry.
What would be the potential cause for systematic preservation?
One of the potential problems is that these types of metamorphic rocks form along active plate margins. So today, most of these data points are on active plate margins. So presumably, through a supercontinent cycle or when an ocean basin closes, these are the most likely to be overprinted by later tectonism. Another problem is that metamorphic overprinting is a kinetic problem, and these data points are lower temperature than something like this. So these are more likely to be overprinted if they experience a later metamorphic event, whereas these types of rocks are more likely to preserve their metamorphic conditions through later reworking. So there's reasons why this might be systematically removed that could make sense, yeah.
So one assumption in the view of the paleontological work that you showed us is that the distribution of oceanic ages is the same as today. And I'm a little bit bothered by that because I could imagine, especially when you discuss the buoyancy of the oceanic lithosphere, that you would have to have the oceanic plate become quite a bit older than what it is today to allow it to subduct. In which case you have a subducting lithosphere which actually is much colder. How much negative heat in it than it does at present. So I'm a little bit, so in that way, how would you reconcile that with you're also talking about hot subduction? I don't see how these subductions would be hotter.
Well, so there's a couple things there. One is that even though they're older, the point is that they're not negatively buoyant until later. And so the real challenge is not so much the thermal gradient of oceanic lithosphere itself, but potentially what the thermal regime is of the underthrusting. So the temperature is going to be essentially the same at the surface as in the past as it is today, give or take atmospheric temperatures, oceanic temperatures. But this is going to but a subduction zone that's steeper like this, more steeply dipping, is going to go to higher pressure more quickly. And that's what's required to have these low temperature conditions at high pressure, whereas something that's shallower would take longer to reach those depths. So it's one of the challenges is that we can't actually observe what the oceanic lithosphere looked like. But I think the key observation is that we see, sorry, I thought it was closer. I think the key observation is that we see the key observation is that we see a bimodality, but that bimodality is just different. And the challenge is how do we interpret that? And this is one hypothesis that's hopefully testable, but maybe it's not correct. Yeah.
I'm wondering, can you put the diagram with the blue and the red line on it again? How do you differentiate between something that is the one that you just were at, that had the two geothermal?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so how do you differentiate a red line like that that's due to hotter subduction from, a regional metamorphic environment where you might have you would expect something kind of similar?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge. I think it's the juxtaposition of different thermal regimes of metamorphism. So it's identifying something like this that's very typical of what we might expect for a continental collisional environment.
Yeah.
And in this case, these rocks here, and comparing that to what is potentially a hotter thermal regime in the hinterland of that orogenic belt.
So you have to preserve that.
So you have to identify not just that, but also the complementary bimodal relationship. And we do see this in isolated cases, which is what this.
So looking for a bimodal distribution on a local regional scale as opposed to just all the metamorphic world.
Exactly. So in these distributions specifically, we see in the Mesoproterozoic orogenic belts and Paleoproterozoic in East Africa, in the Grenville, the Sueco-Norwegian, the Bellamorian, that there are these contrasting high and low temperature metamorphic rocks, and often juxtaposed structurally in the way that we would predict for, if not a subduction, at least an underthrusting type scenario. So I think the key is there's very good examples of this here. We probably see some examples of this here as well, but trying to document those a bit more carefully because those data are sparse.